Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling how science fiction imagines civilizations rising and falling and all the forces that might be in play.
Oh, it's going to be a good one.
It is. We've got some really fascinating sources to work with today.
Definitely.
Dystopian classics, your 1984 and Neuromancer, but also
Right?
big epics like Dune, Foundation. And then to keep us honest, we'll look at some real-world stuff too.
Oh, for sure.
Like how's AI actually being used to try and predict the future
Yeah.
and all the implications of surveillance getting more and more powerful.
It's really striking to me that these aren't just stories. They're tapping into some very real anxieties about our own future. Hopes and fears about tech, power, what it means to be human when the world's changing so fast.
It's like holding a mirror, right,
Right.
to like our collective psyche or whatever.
Exactly.
And Foundation is, well, it's a great place to start, I think. Asimov just throws this wild concept out there, psychohistory. Like you can actually predict the future of societies using math. Now that sounds like, pure science fiction, but how much is there any plausible science behind that at all?
Well, I mean, the idea is that if you have enough data, right, and the right mathematical tools, you can start to see these patterns, trends, and then you can forecast those large-scale shifts in society.
Hmm.
It's kind of like how we predict the weather now, in a way. Complex systems, a bit unpredictable for sure, but still governed by some underlying rules.
So if Asimov was writing Foundation today, with all the big data and the algorithms we've got now, would he be, like, surprised? Or would it be more like, I told you so?
I think he'd probably get a kick out of how much reality is starting to look like his fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, look at how AI is being used now.
Mm-hmm.
Stock markets, diseases.
Mm-hmm.
There are even companies out there claiming they can predict crime before it happens.
Well, hold on. That's getting into, like, Minority Report territory.
Right.
Ethically, that's a whole other can of worms.
Absolutely. What happens when those predictions start to influence people's behavior? You get these self-fulfilling prophecies. Like, what if an algorithm flags someone as a potential criminal? Does that make them more likely to be treated like one, even if they haven't actually done anything?
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Makes me think about Dune, too, where prophecy is this huge driving force, but often it's manipulated for power.
Mhm.
Is that tapping into that same anxiety about predicting the future?
I think it speaks to this very human fascination we have with knowing what's coming next. But Dune is a warning too, right? Believing in a particular future, especially if that belief is based on bad information or intentionally messed with information, it can make that future more likely to happen.
Oh, wow.
Prophecy can be a self-fulfilling thing.
Okay, so predicting the future is maybe more complicated than we think,
Yeah.
and potentially a lot more dangerous.
Yeah.
But speaking of anxieties about technology, Neuromancer goes down a different road, I think, but it's equally unsettling. Like this bleak picture of a society run by megacorporations and tech that's both amazing and kind of terrifying at the same time.
Right.
Does any of that sound familiar?
Maybe more than we'd like to admit.
Yeah.
Neuromancer plays on our fears about technology advancing too fast and these corporations getting too much power. It's a world where the lines between technology and human life, they've gotten so blurry you can barely tell where one ends and the other begins.
And then there's the surveillance in 1984, which is just creepy, straight up. Telescreens everywhere, watching your every move, every thought.
Right.
Ugh, gives me chills.
1984 takes the surveillance state to the extreme, right? No privacy, even your thoughts are policed.
It's wild how relevant that feels today, in our digital age. Think about all the data we create every day. Online, our location, our conversations. It's all being collected, analyzed.
Yeah.
It does feel like we're sleepwalking into a cyberpunk dystopia. Like Neuromancer meets 1984. And AI seems to be at the heart of it. Both those stories, the peripheral too, they highlight how easy it would be to use AI-driven surveillance to control people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In 1984, you've got thought police using tech to force everyone to conform. And in the peripheral, they're using AI to control people across different realities even. It really begs the question, what happens when we give these systems power before we really understand them?
Yeah, what happens when we don't understand the consequences?
Exactly.
It's unsettling. But on that note, let's talk about AI itself, how it's depicted in these stories.
Yeah.
You've got HAL 9000 from 2001, totally cold and logical.
Right.
Then you've got Murderbot, which is surprisingly relatable, even funny.
Yeah.
And then the AI in the peripheral is kind of more ambiguous.
Yeah.
So how does science fiction wrestle with this question of whether machines can actually think?
It's a question that just keeps coming back, right? One of the big ones in science fiction. From HAL's like totally rational but terrifying decision making to Murderbot wanting to be left alone but also having these really human-like thoughts.
Hmm.
It makes us think about what consciousness really
Yeah,
means.
what does it mean to be conscious?
Right. Like, are we talking about AI having feelings,
Hmm.
self-awareness, or is it something else entirely?
Right, right. It gets really tricky there. Is it about, like, replicating human emotions?
Hmm.
Or is it more that AI develops a sense of itself, like it can make decisions based on its own goals, not just what it was programmed to do?
That's where it gets interesting.
Because that's when things start to feel a little, Terminator-ish.
Yeah, and that fear of the unknown, of losing control, it's a big theme in a lot of science fiction. But it's important to remember that these stories, they're not necessarily saying this is exactly how the future is going to be.
Right.
They're holding up a mirror,
Yeah.
making us ask tough questions about where we're headed.
Less about answers, more about making us think critically.
Exactly.
So here's the big question then. Are these visions of the future just fiction? Or are they showing us something about where humanity's inevitably headed? Are we on this, like, predetermined path to collapse? Or can we change course?
That's a question that's been around forever, hasn't it? Philosophers, scientists, everyone. And science fiction gives us this unique way to explore it. It doesn't give us easy answers, but it does encourage us to think about the consequences of our actions, the long game,
Hmm.
and to look at the forces that are shaping our world.
So it's a warning, but it's also a challenge.
I think so.
Don't just accept the future that's being shown to you.
Yeah.
Question it. Fight for something better. But how do we even start doing that? Where do we find hope when things feel so overwhelming?
Well, that's where we start to get into ideas about resilience, resistance, even the darkest dystopias. They have these glimmers of hope.
Right.
And we're going to explore those themes in a lot more depth in the next part of our deep dive.
We are. We are. And I think that's a great place to pause for now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a minute to wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts to chew on.
I mean, a lot of these science fiction stories, they show us societies that have gotten kind of complacent, or where technology has gone so far that it's actually become a threat, not a tool.
Right, right.
They're like cautionary tales, these warnings about relying too much on technology and what happens when power goes unchecked.
So like in Dune, where their whole thing is built on spice and super advanced tech, but it's made them really vulnerable too.
Yeah, exactly.
And Foundation, that giant galactic empire, so bureaucratic, it's practically begging to collapse. It makes you wonder, are those fictional scenarios really that far off from what's happening in our world?
That's the point, isn't it? They're highlighting the cyclical nature of civilizations. Even the
Mm.
most powerful empires, they can crumble,
Hmm.
from their own arrogance or because they fail to adapt.
Right, they can't keep up.
But there's hope, too, even in those stories. Even in the bleakest dystopias, you find people resisting, fighting for freedom.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Like Winston in 1984, he might not win in the traditional sense, but he never gives up,
Yeah.
you know? That spark of humanity, that's what makes it so powerful.
Right.
And then you've got the Freeman in Dune, fiercely independent, making a life in this brutal environment.
They're amazing. I mean, for those who maybe haven't read Dune, the Freemen are these desert nomads. They've adapted to the harshest conditions imaginable on Arrakis.
Right, the planet where it all takes place.
Yeah, and they have this deep spiritual connection to the planet and its resources, especially the spice melange, which is basically what makes interstellar travel possible. And they've figured out how to survive, how to thrive. They're a force to be reckoned with.
Their resilience is incredible. And it seems like that's something you see a lot in science fiction.
Definitely.
This idea that even when things are stacked against us, humans can adapt, we can survive.
It's like these authors are saying, don't underestimate the human spirit, no matter how bad things get.
It's encouraging in a way.
It is. I mean, I think that's a big part of what science fiction does. It's like this thought experiment exploring potential futures, seeing the consequences of choices we make.
Right, right.
And by looking at what works and what doesn't in these fictional civilizations, we learn about what shapes our own world. We learn about resilience, adaptation, the importance of hope.
So it's not all doom and gloom then. There's a chance we can avoid a real-life dystopia.
I'd like to think so.
I mean, I'm a little relieved to hear that, honestly.
Science fiction, it doesn't hand us easy answers, but it does make us think critically about the things that are happening, and about the long-term impact of our actions.
So it's a reminder that we have agency.
Exactly. We can shape our own destiny, even in a world where technology is getting more and more influential.
Which, speaking of, brings us back to AI and its role in all this.
Yeah.
We talked about it potentially becoming conscious, but we've also seen how it can be used for surveillance, control, often with really bad results. It's like this double-edged sword, amazing potential, but also the possibility of doing a lot of damage.
That tension, yeah, that's at the heart of so much science fiction.
Hmm.
On one hand, AI could improve our lives, help us solve problems, maybe even help us understand consciousness itself better.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's this real risk of it being used to oppress people or creating systems that we lose control of.
It's a classic hi-fi dilemma.
Right. Will it save us or destroy us?
And do we even get a say in that, or is it all going to play out according to some algorithm we don't understand? Makes you want to just unplug completely sometimes.
I get that. But I think instead of giving in to that fear, these stories are pushing us to have a more informed conversation about the future.
Okay, yeah.
To recognize that AI has benefits, but to be aware of the risks too, and to hold the people who are developing it accountable.
Makes sense. So it's not about rejecting technology altogether.
No.
It's about being mindful, using it responsibly.
Yeah.
It's a tool, after all.
Right. And like any tool, it can be used in different ways. The question is, are we in control or is it controlling us?
That's a good question. And that responsibility, it's on all of us, isn't it?
It is. We need to be informed, ask the tough questions, demand transparency, ethical considerations. We can't just sit back and let whatever happens happen.
You know, I'm feeling a little more sense of urgency now.
Yeah.
Like, we need to be more proactive about shaping the future,
Yeah.
not just letting it happen to us. But it's also kind of exciting.
How so?
Well, we're not just along for the ride, right?
Yeah.
We have the power to make choices that will affect things for us and for future generations.
Absolutely. That's, I think, one of the most powerful takeaways from all this. The future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together through what we do, how we choose to act.
You know, speaking of collective action, there's one more thing for these stories I wanted to touch on.
Okay.
The idea of revolution, and how even groups that seem powerless can rise up and overturn oppressive systems.
Ah, yes, the underdog story.
Right. It's a recurring theme, and it says something really important about resistance, resilience.
It does. We see it in 1984 with the proles, the everyday people who Winston believes could actually overthrow Big Brother.
Hmm.
And in Dune, the Fremen, at first they're just seen as these primitive desert dwellers, but they end up becoming a major force for change.
It's fascinating. Like, these stories are suggesting that power isn't always where we think it is.
Right.
It's the marginalized, the overlooked, the underestimated. They're the ones with the strength, the resilience to really change things.
Because they have a different perspective, they see the world differently, and that can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's a powerful message. Don't underestimate anyone, no matter how disenfranchised they might seem.
And it's also about empathy, understanding, seeing that shared humanity, even when there are huge differences between people.
It's a reminder that change can come from unexpected places,
It can.
and that we shouldn't give up hope even when things look bleak.
That's important.
There's always the possibility for positive change, for people to come together and build something better. It might not be easy, it might take time, but it's possible.
And that hope, it often comes from the most unexpected places. The fringes of society, the whispers of dissent, the quiet acts of courage that challenge the way things are.
Mm.
These stories, they remind us that the future isn't set in stone. It's constantly changing, and we all have a part in how it unfolds.
Wow, that's a lot to think about, but it's also really inspiring.
In what way?
Well, it's like, even with all the challenges, there's always hope.
Yeah,
There's always the possibility for things to get better.
absolutely. And that's part of what makes science fiction so compelling.
It is.
It's not just about escaping into these amazing worlds. It's about facing the big questions, exploring what's possible, and ultimately finding hope even when things are uncertain. It's about recognizing that we have the power to act and to use that power to create a future that's worthy of our dreams.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, I think we're at a good point to pause for a moment.
Okay.
But stick with us. We'll be back shortly to wrap up our deep dive and leave you with some final thoughts to ponder. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Psychohistory, prophecy, AI surveillance, even the nature of consciousness. I'm feeling, I don't know, a little bit of everything right now, honestly.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. But that's what science fiction does, right? It makes you feel it all. It makes you question things, confront your fears, but it also reminds you how resilient we are, that we can create a better future.
Like, we've peeked into all these different realities, good and bad, and now we get to decide what we want to build.
Exactly.
So the big question is, where do we go from here? What do we actually do with all these insights, warnings, those bits of hope?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that we're not just along for the ride, you know? We have a choice. We have power. We can make decisions that will actually shape things. These stories aren't about some predetermined outcome. They're about making us think, having real conversations, and demanding better from the people in charge.
It's about realizing that the future isn't set in stone. It's more like a blank canvas, and we get to paint it with our actions, our choices.
I like
And
that.
technology, yeah, it's shaping the world, but it's still a tool. Like any tool, it can be used in good ways or bad.
Absolutely. We have to be aware of the consequences of what we're creating, make sure it's being used ethically. We have to be careful about protecting our privacy, our freedoms, especially with everything becoming more and more digital. But most importantly, we can't forget that it's human connection, empathy, compassion. Those are the things that build a good society.
It's like science fiction is giving us this map, not with turn-by-turn directions, but with signs pointing out different paths,
Right.
showing us what to maybe avoid and what possibilities are out there.
And it reminds us that we're not alone in this. We had each other, and we have all these writers, thinkers who've explored these ideas before us. Their stories give us guidance, inspiration, and they remind us that even when things are really dark, the human spirit can overcome anything.
That's a powerful thought. So, as we wrap up our deep dive here, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
Imagine you've got a pen and a blank page. That page, that's the next chapter in humanity's story.
Hmm.
What do you write? What kind of future do you see? And how can we use what we've learned from these amazing science fiction works to help us deal with the tough stuff and really grab on to those opportunities that are out there?
That's a great image to leave everyone with because in the end, we get to write the future. Let's make it a story worth telling.